innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Did we mention it's free?
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
Hello and welcome to Science Cafe New Hampshire. This is our fourth virtual Science Cafe since COVID-19 drove us all indoors. My name is Dave Brooks. I'm the original moderator of Science Cafe since it was started back in 2011. 9 years we've been doing this, and over that period we have brought hundreds of experts to answer questions from thousands of people in bars and restaurants and now computer screens. And we're going to keep doing it because, frankly, it's got an audience, it serves a purpose, and it's a lot of fun. So today's topic is food allergies and food sensitivities, what they are, what they aren't, what you can do about them now that we're all indoors eating more, what you can't do about them, how you should react. We've got a doctor, we've got a dietitian, we've got a health coach, all to talk about what they know and to, most importantly, to answer your questions. The format's simple. They'll be introduced, they'll give a little bit of introductory material, talk about themselves briefly, but the entire session is driven by your questions. So prepare to ask them and follow up and see what other people are asking through Facebook Live or through YouTube. That's the way it works. So grab the beverage of your choice and sit back, and I will hand things off to moderator Rick Irving.
Hi, Dave. Thank you. Well done. So as David said, my name is Rick Irving. I'll be the moderator for tonight's show. We have an excellent panel here tonight. I will introduce them briefly and then give each one of them a chance to tell you about their background and their relationship with food allergies and sensitivities. And after that's all done, we will go right into the questions and answers and take those until right near the finish. We will have Representative Rosemarie Rung join us and talk about some legislation that's going on in the state of New Hampshire. And then we will finish up after that. So without further ado, we have four panelists. The first one is Alyssa Fernandez. She has a master's degree from the University of North Florida. She is a registered dietitian. We have Sarah Lawrence, who is a functional nutrition and lifestyle practitioner. And we have Dr. Heather Ruhm, who is a teacher of holistic, functional, and integrative medicines for 20 years. And as I said, Rosemarie Rung, representative from New Hampshire, will also join us. And so we'll go back and have Alyssa. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you fit in with the food allergy and food sensitivities topic?
Sure. So my name is Alyssa Fernandez, and I'm a registered dietitian. I have a few different jobs right now, one of them being a corporate wellness dietitian. So that is what I do part of the week. Another part of the week, I am a private practice dietitian. So I work with counseling clients one-on-one. And the last part of my week, I work at Plymouth State University. So I'm the campus dietitian there. And that is the job that is probably most relevant to what we'll be talking about today. I do a lot in their dining hall for their students, and I really try to advocate for the students that have food allergies and medical conditions. So we've done a lot with the dining hall there and made it really, really kind of, usable and functional for students that are trying to avoid the top 8 allergens. So I think we'll be able to add that to today's conversation.
Thank you. Sarah, would you take some time to tell us about yourself, what you do, and again, how you relate to the food allergy and food sensitivities topic?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. My name is Sarah Lawrence. I am a functional nutrition and lifestyle practitioner and a holistic health coach. I have a practice in the New Hampshire Health and Wellness Center in Nashua. So I do see clients one-on-one. I also offer some group programs. And primarily my job is to help people transition if they have any particular dietary needs. We do see a lot of people with Lyme disease, with autoimmune conditions, and food sensitivities and food allergies can really play into that a lot. I do work with a lot of families and children who have been recently diagnosed with a food allergy or food sensitivity and helping them to transition into that new normal, that new plan. So I see people from really young to middle age and older. Food allergies and food sensitivities can happen at any time. I also do have some personal experience with food allergies and food sensitivities. In particular, it really impacted my autoimmune arthritis. So I know firsthand what a bear these things can be. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Heather, would you tell us about yourself?
Sure, my name is Dr. Heather Tallman Ruhm, but most people call me Dr. Heather. And I've been practicing medicine in New Hampshire for, I guess, over a dozen years, and I've been in practice for 20. And I've mostly been in the field of holistic, integrative, or what we now call functional medicine, where we're looking at underlying causes and root sources of different forms of suffering. That's from small children with severe suffering, maybe autism today, or an older population. So both physical and mental conditions that in some way cause some kind of hardship in a person's life. So that being said, there are some real fundamental things that can add to what we call the body burden, which as most of us in this field think the body is designed in a way to help you heal and to thrive and to be everything it can be. And it's oftentimes either something is harming it or there is a deficiency. So there's an excess or not enough of something to function adequately. And so looking at the things that disturb that, one of the things that can disturb that is nutrition or lack of nutrition. And in particular, what's happening in the lining of the intestinal tract where most of your immune system is. And so there's a lot of emphasis in this field on GI health, on lifestyle, on nutrition. And what we often see, as the other two have already stated, that there is a significant issue of people having complications due to the foods that they eat, whether they be an immediate reaction, which is more of an allergy, and we can get into that a little bit more probably when we talk about allergens versus sensitivities, but a very quick reaction that is life-threatening, and then delayed type reactions where people may have, as Sarah expressed, conditions that are exacerbated by or triggered by certain foods or certain food combinations. And that has to do with that, the role of our intestinal tract, the place that it houses, our body houses the lion's share of the immune system is right in the lining of your intestinal tract. So much happens there, and there's some real receptors and antennas in the intestinal tract that let us know whether something is an added irritant or body burden that gets us to the point of having some sort of manifestation as a sign or a symptom. So I've been doing this for quite a long time, and food's played a major role in helping people from, like I said, the severest conditions like autism or mental health issues to physical manifestations in the joints, the skin, the eyes, the ears, you name it. So look forward to talking more and jumping in to people's questions.
Well, that's great. That gives us an awful lot to talk about. And Rosemarie, would you like to introduce yourself? And as I said, we'll give you time at the end to go ahead and go into more depth.
Thank you very much. My name is Rosemarie Rung, and I'm a state representative for Merrimack, New Hampshire, which is Hillsborough 21. I wasn't really engaged in the food allergy issue until I heard from a constituent a couple years ago whose niece had died from an anaphylactic reaction she got from eating food at a restaurant, and she was looking for legislation to help control or better assist people with food allergies when they're dining out. So I did a lot of research on the issue. I drafted a bill, HB 1102, to address food allergies and provide more assistance for those suffering from them. It passed the House overwhelmingly, but it got hung up in the Senate because of the COVID-19 put delays on our ability to vote on bills. But it'll be introduced in September, and I can go into more detail later about it.
Great, thank you. So for our audience, you can get online right now and start asking your questions via Facebook or YouTube. And we have people behind the scenes that will be sorting those out and feeding them to us. In the meantime, last night we had a little get together to try and, familiarize each other with what was going to happen tonight and introduce ourselves. And there was a fascinating conversation that was being held. So I thought that would be a great place to start. It's what is the difference between food allergies and food sensitivities? And Dr. Heather, since you kicked that off last night, why don't you go ahead and do that again right now?
Sure. I think that we often use the term food allergy because we all know that, and we've all been familiar with that all our lives. And when we, in the classic sense of the word, an allergen is something that creates a reaction in you that can be quite severe. And in particular, when it comes to food, when we think of allergies, we think of things that trigger what we call an antibody reaction, in this case, IgE. And that can lead to a whole cascade of chemicals released in your body that cause the swelling and anaphylaxis and potentially could be fatal for someone. So the classic allergens we might think of are shellfish or peanut allergies, where there's a dramatic event like the peanut discussion a minute ago. So that's what we think of as an allergen. And so when we've gone to the allergist, we have checked through either blood tests or through the prick test you've probably heard of, where you do little pricks along the skin and see what kind of a reaction you get. Or if you want to see if your tuberculosis vaccine is still working, you can do or if you've had tuberculosis, you can get a reaction in the skin. So those are allergens, or their responses in an allergic way to the point of anaphylaxis potentially. Food sensitivities have more to do with an intolerance or something that is triggered in you that isn't necessarily that severe of a reaction. It can create severe consequences, and some that may lead to a slow death or chronic illnesses, but they are a little bit more insidious, less obvious. And when we test for those kinds of things, we test for antibodies. Everyone's aware of the COVID antibody now, or they want to be tested to see if their body responded to that thing that's foreign to it, that it doesn't like, and see if they're protected thereafter. But if you have an antibody to the food that's like not an IgE, but an IgG or immunoglobulin G or immunoglobulin M, or sometimes an immunoglobulin A, those particular types of immunoglobulins or antibodies, they tell us whether you're having a reaction to that particular food. So my colleagues and I will help you, or those listening, hopefully, understand some ways to look into intolerances other than blood testing or antibody testing. But that's really there's a significant amount of food sensitivity and food intolerance, such that if you say have a reaction to gluten, which I know is a topic that will come up tonight, if you have a reaction to that, it may be a delayed type reaction. It could be as severe as celiac disease, where your intestinal lining is significantly impacted, that what should look like a shag rug lies down like a Berber carpet. And so your functionality of your gut lining is very impaired. And that can manifest a lot of other conditions as well, and be associated with other autoimmune conditions, where we're not only, quote unquote, under attack of our own intestinal tract, but other things as well, or other systems can be impacted. And as Sarah brought up, can lead to an autoimmune condition. And when I say attack, I say in quotes, because I don't think those of us who see the body as healing and supportive to our livelihood and our ongoing life, we don't really see the body as attacking itself so much, but that's become the common nomenclature for more of an intolerance or a reaction to something then we, I think, get caught in the crossfire. And so we become kind of under our own body's siege, as it were, when we find an offensive agent and then we release chemicals or antibodies against that, we get caught in our own crossfire. So what we're talking about tonight is more the food sensitivities than true allergens. Or at least that's from a nutritional and medical standpoint. Those are the things that we're trying to address in our clinical setting. In the cafe setting or the school setting, we're also paying closer attention to the more severe allergens. So those would be first and foremost because they're most critically worrisome. And then beyond that, there are a host of, and I know losing people's names right off the top of my head here. Thank you, Alyssa. I know you talked a bit about the 8 main ones, so we can talk about what those are, 8 main food intolerances. And I'd love to have you guys share more about how you go about either discerning that, Sarah, as you mentioned, or some of the therapies you would do to address that. Is that helpful? The difference between the allergen and the sensitivity?
Yes. Sarah or Alyssa, would you like to jump in and add anything?
I think that everything that you mentioned was spot on. And to kind of summarize that, for someone who wants to kind of like pull that information quickly, basically an allergen is definitely an immune response. And that's a very defined kind of thing to have. Whereas an intolerance, that might be, not so much an immune response, but maybe you lack the enzyme in your intestine that helps break down that food item. So you get some type of reaction, like you're intolerant to that food. And then a sensitivity, I would say in my learning, and I think in like the science and the way I interpret it with time, I think sensitivities and food sensitivities is one of the more recent kind of topics when we're talking about those 3 things, allergies, intolerance, and sensitivities. So sensitivities, like I said, it's a very new topic, and most of the way that I help people define those in their lives is kind of listening, really paying close attention to their bodies, where it might not come up just very blatantly on a test. They might have these symptoms or side effects that you're able to work with, and then kind of learn more about their diet to learn exactly what's setting that off. So those are kind of a little more, they're like discrete. They're not so defined. They're a little hidden. So you really have to learn that person and their body to figure out what that is.
Great. Absolutely, I agree. And I think often when you have a food allergy, you can get answers a little bit more quickly because it's such an acute reaction, and it's really one of those things that presents in a very it can present in a very quick way. Number one, I mean, that's the thing that we know about food allergies. So they're faster. They can take up to an hour or two to develop, but certainly that seems to be the quicker one. Food intolerances and food sensitivities are where I really see people getting frustrated because they're not as cut and dry, right off the bat. You may eat something one time and feel gross or have a GI symptom, and the next time you may not. And I think that goes back to what Heather said in the beginning about total body burden. With a food intolerance and a food sensitivity, if your body is at a tipping point and you happen to eat one of those things that you're sensitive or intolerant to, I think you're more likely to experience, a symptom than if you're in, really great health, you're eating impeccably, then you may not respond as strongly. So I find at least that people who have the food intolerances and food sensitivities seem to feel a little bit more frustrated, at least in the beginning when we're trying to get a handle on those things. So I wonder if we talk about, what kind of testing is available and how you can actually figure that out.
Okay, great. Since the gluten has come up so early in the conversation, why don't we switch to that? What is gluten, and what is its role in a person's diet?
Do you want me to start us off?
Sure.
Okay. I do see that there's some good questions popping up too, so we'll have to be cognizant of those. So gluten, everybody knows that term now, and I think if you're my age and when you're growing up, you hadn't heard the term until you were in your 30s or something. But gluten is a protein found in grains such as wheat, barley, and rye. And it is also sometimes a contaminant in other grains that are processed in the same context as wheat, barley, and rye. And glutens are a family of proteins. And we think of gliadin as a kind of subcomponent, and there are many of those. So people can be sensitive to this protein, which is quite large. one of the things that Alyssa brought up is that we may not be able to digest something very well, like we may not be able to break something down. And some of the things that fall into the highest level of sensitivities or most common sensitivities or intolerances are gluten, soy, dairy. All of them have very large proteins inherent in their makeup. And I say inherent, I mean, we have also encultured things to become heavier in gluten, for instance, over time. So the cultivars are different over time as well. So some of our more ancient grains didn't contain as much. Gluten is that stretchy, wonderful substance that gives pizza its yumminess, that you can, throw it up in the air and make a Frisbee out of it. And it makes things very easy and pliable to stretch and stay together. That's why some people have a difficult time when it comes to gluten-free products, because there isn't that stretchy doughiness that keeps the gluten together. Unfortunately, gluten is a very hard protein to digest. And your body can take a very large protein and divide it into segments, but maybe not be able to divide it completely into its smaller components, such as what we call polypeptides, small chains of protein, or even smaller to amino acids. And now amino acids are the very smallest building block of the proteins of our body. So we make our own bodies out of the same ingredients, say, as gluten, but we may not be able to access it because we don't have the digestive wherewithal to break that gluten down and take advantage of its smallest components. So what can happen is that can become an offensive item, especially if there is any integrity issues in the intestinal lining. And there are certainly plenty of issues in our environment today that can create some vulnerability or integrity issues of our intestinal lining and our ability to digest things. So at a time when we are kind of bombarded with a body burden of more things that can be hard to digest, more things that are competing for digestion or disrupting our own ability to digest, then those large proteins become more offensive. And if there is, what this term will probably come up later too, is leaky gut, meaning our intestinal lining has some integrity issues, doesn't have that nice smooth mucousy barrier, or there is some integrity issues from breakdown of the lining, then what can happen with those giant proteins, as it were, relatively speaking, to those that should come through a cell, they can slip through between cells. They can leak into our body. And as I mentioned, our whole defense system, or most of our defense system, our immune system, is located in and near the intestinal lining. So if things leak into your body, into your bloodstream, into your lymphatics, into other parts of you, then your body is on hyper alert and saying, what is that? It's kind of like suddenly realizing there's a Trojan horse that got in, to behind your barricade. And so those immune responses that happen can be, as Alyssa said, they may be an immune response. They may not be an immune response in terms of like just intolerant, we can't seem to digest something. But if you can't digest it and it continues to be a problem and there are any integrity issues, then it becomes more of a sensitivity where your body's immune system is responding. Let me add a little mini piece to that immune system responding. I mentioned antibodies as a form of defense, and that's our kind of our sharpshooters. Those are antibodies specific to something or semi-specific. They might be your response to a particular thing like gluten, but you may have thyroid tissue that's also vulnerable to that same antibody. So, for instance, if gluten becomes an antibody to that, you may manifest as an antibody to the thyroid and then have a thyroid condition. So those often go hand in hand, a gluten sensitivity or a true allergen or a thyroid condition. The other part is the immune system has different layers of response. And one of them, which we've learned about the most about probably in the last 10 years or maybe 15, is the innate immune system, which is a cascade of chemicals that are not antibodies that can also, and I think many people have learned the word cytokine over the course of COVID. That's a chemical reaction to something that's foreign to the body that's creating havoc. So sometimes the damage is worse from that cascade of chemicals than it is from the actual offender.
Very informative. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, then we're going to switch to some user questions. And I should say, for the folks that are dialing in, please keep your questions coming, YouTube or Facebook, and we will get to them as soon as we can. And here is our first one from Margaret. Why can I eat processed tomatoes and apples, cooked until soft, but not fresh tomatoes and apples?
I would say my first response to that would be wondering what exactly kind of the side effects or the outcome is that you're experiencing and the difference between processed tomatoes and apples cooked versus not cooked. Like, what exactly are you experiencing? Is it cramping? Is it indigestion? Or is it acid reflux? Or what exactly does that look like? A lot of times with these foods, for example, with apples, this is a very fibrous food, and when it's eaten raw, it could be pictured as very coarse, and it could be harder to break these types of things down. And when we cook vegetables and cook things like that, we kind of are breaking them down ahead of time and leading to kind of less work for our body once it's inside.
Oh, that makes great sense. Margaret, if you're still on, go ahead and give us what your reactions to these things are, and we'll try and get back to you. Anybody else for that question?
Yeah, I'd just like to add on that with anything that's fresh, so when you're looking at a fresh tomato or a fresh apple, the body may need to use different enzymes in order to break that down. So when you cook it, I mean, you are denaturing that product a little bit, and the process then of being able to digest it can change. So sometimes people will be able to tolerate a food that is cooked when they can't tolerate it when it's raw. You know, and Margaret, maybe one of the things that you're experiencing as well, in addition to those symptoms that Alyssa listed off, is it may be a tingling in the mouth. You might get a raw feeling on your tongue or in your throat. So, you know, oral allergy syndrome can come up in that regard. And sometimes we do see that people can tolerate things that are cooked or even blended, like really, if you blend something in a high-powered food processor or blender, that action of just breaking it down a little bit can help the body with digesting. We're in the back. Not in all cases, but in some.
Okay, that makes great sense. So our next question is from Facebook from Ottilie, who asks, I have to avoid onions and limit garlic. Onions are added to so many things. Are there certain components of a food, its DNA, that triggers the sensitivity or allergy versus other foods?
I can start with a little stab at that, since we're kind of passing the piece back. So that's a really nice observation, and I think what Alyssa and Sarah were getting at earlier, it's nice when you're in tune with your own body, and so you're actually noticing something that subtle, and maybe it's not so subtle for you when you're experiencing onions or garlic. One thing that onions and garlic have in common is they're a high sulfur food. So I might be asking next, are eggs a problem for you too? So those kind of sulfur-based foods that come with the aroma oftentimes of a rotten egg, but they can come with that aroma. That can be not so much the DNA per se of the product itself, but it can actually be yours. And so there is some genetic testing. You've probably heard of 23andMe or some of the big genome tests that display your genetic predispositions, right? And some of those have more difficulty with sulfur. And so that can be geographic and individual. So for instance, somebody who's of a kind of a southern descent, they may, like Latin American, may tolerate sulfur, which is in a lot of the products, like the beans have a lot of sulfur, dried beans that can be a major part of the diet in Latin America. Someone from that part of the country might tolerate that better from a genetic standpoint, whereas somebody from a more northern climate might not be able to tolerate those sulfurs or have them in a very small quantity. So one thing that can be beneficial is limiting the amount of those sulfur-rich foods for somebody who has that kind of sensitivity. And I'm sure there are other things, so I'll start with that part.
Thank you.
I can add in a little bit here too. One of the things that I would note with onion and garlic is that they both contain fructans. And so essentially that's you may have heard of the FODMAP diet. So it's one component of the FODMAP diet. So fructans, while it's not like, that is kind of what we would call like the DNA of the food. It's that particular component of both of those things. So if you're sensitive to that, we could look at other things that contain fructans and look to eliminate or reduce those and see how you respond. The thing with fructans, and I don't know if you've ever tried this, is that they are soluble in water. So sometimes if you cook them and you cook them in water, a little bit of that content, that fructan content, can leach out, and it can make it a little bit more tolerable. So that's what I can add about those two in particular from that perspective.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. Why are there so many food allergies or intolerances in children these days than there were in previous generations? It should start with, do you agree or disagree, I suppose?
Agree. There's no question in my mind that there are more sensitivities and allergies today. And you see that in other conditions that what we call atopy, or those conditions that lead to eczema, allergy, asthma, they're all kind of grouped in. And so we've seen an increase, significant increase, many fold over the last 20 years of that. So why is that? And I think it gets back to one, body burden, in particular, how much has your immune system been challenged and by what, and what other competing interests are there. So our modern children have opportunities, or quote unquote opportunities, I don't know that they're positive, but opportunities to be exposed to a lot more chemicals, heavy metals, pesticides, pollutants, the food that is less rich in the nutrients and things that would counter and give us higher capabilities for handling digestion and all of the things that go along with the immune system. So unfortunately for our children today, there are deficiencies and toxicities that were less of an issue, except for in times of, say, starvation or limited food supply, in terms of the deficiencies, but also a lot of toxicities that were not present in prior times, or were not present in as broad a context from so many different directions. So our immune systems for our children have been very challenged in a way that ours weren't. And I don't, challenge to the immune system can be good. One challenge to the immune system is hygiene. So the fact that we are hyper hygienic, we know some things like children who have animals, pets, and are around their pets have less or have a less propensity for some allergens, or for like hay fever and that kind of thing. We have babies that are born to a family which is high atopic, as I mentioned, the allergies, asthma, eczema in the family, heavily induced in their children, their siblings at an earlier age. And those babies, when the next, fourth one in line, can be given a probiotic right out of the womb at the day of birth, and have a much less of a possibility for having atopic or allergy type propensities. So there are different arms of our immune system, which we may not get into tonight as much, that make you more kind of autoimmune or more allergic, or make you more vulnerable in different ways. And I think our kids are a little bit of a ping pong balls to get pushed into those different directions. So the hygiene thing, it's a deficiency of good organisms. And they've come into the world at a time where many generations now, or several at least, deep into antibiotics. So even a mother's exposure to antibiotics, or all the antibiotics we see in our produce, in our animals, all of those are on bombardment on the immune system, for example, but there are many other things.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up. So 100 years ago, when I was a kid, could I have had some of these problems and just never knew about it? There was no way to figure it out?
That's always a possibility, that there is more awareness around something. But I think that argument doesn't hold up when you look statistically, even for those things that caused anaphylaxis, because that's not a surprise. I mean, that's kind of a is or isn't. as far as understanding the connection between some of those things that may have been a problem in the past, maybe a mental health issue that you had growing up or someone you knew had growing up,
Yeah, that would be me.
may have come about from food. Food sensitivities may have exacerbated that or contributed to that, and you didn't have that awareness. So some of the awareness around the role of foods and our GI tract and our immune system and the connection between all those systems, that we are a biological system of systems where there's an interplay between them. And now that we understand the microbiome, we didn't really, if you had gotten one antibiotic in your childhood and then your children got 5 and then their children got 20, each layer of that is dumbing down our ecosystem, which is a huge and robust part of our health. So our microbiome, as you may know, the number of bacterial organisms in our intestinal lining primarily, which is where most of them hang out. I mean, obviously they're in all our orifices in our tissue, but the lion's share hangs out in that mucus, lovely mucus place where we're getting exchange of nutrients. And those organisms, they create nutrition for us. They help in our digestion. If you deplete an animal's gut of all their bacteria, they can't even produce their own immune cells. So they play a really critical and functional role in all systems in our body. And if you look, for instance, at our population, which I'm presuming you're probably from the same country I am, by the way you talk and look, that you're in a country that has had a heavy burden of that antibiotic and those forms of anti-organism, whatever that is, anti-life, anti-bio, right? And so if you take, for instance, the biome of the African population at large relative to the American population at large, the diversity of our ecosystem is so scant compared to the Africans right now. And so if you look back to our lineage, and with the big microbiome research going on and looking at what bugs are associated with what illness and what symptoms and everything else, you can see why we are so low on the health scale as a nation compared to even a lot of what we used to call developing countries, that seemed like they had less technology or less civilization, as it were. They weren't, so you see in those countries where there is more preservation of natural foods and eating foods that have come to you ripened and that are local or that are fermented and given that opportunity to grow organisms outside of your body and then put them into your body like our ancestors did in their beet kvass and kefir and cultures and yogurts and things. That we don't do that. One, we don't supplant and put that back. And two, we do a lot of things that take our microbiome down. So just like investing your money, your microbiome requires a diverse portfolio. And we in America have one of the weakest portfolios when it comes to our microbiome.
Oh, very educational. So Sarah and Alyssa, I see you both nodding as she was talking. Does that mean you agree, you have something to add, or you just agree that I'm old?
We're in this together.
Well, I think that Heather made a lot of great points, and I think that Alyssa would agree. I mean, we have stats from the CDC that do show that that the incidence of childhood allergies has increased. I think the number is 50% between 1997 and 2010. I think was the latest one, but that's huge. And looking at the reasons why, I think Heather touched on a lot of them. What I see in practice is, parents, and myself included, I have a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old, convenience foods, who doesn't want to go for those, but they're not necessarily the best choice. And, we look at how we've gotten away from, whole foods, from seasonal eating, even from local foods. And, who can say that that doesn't have an impact? I certainly think that it does. Alyssa, what's your take on that?
I agree with both of those points. I really appreciated the incorporation of the talking of the microbiome, because I think that has a lot to do with it. And I'm not sure if everyone understands, I know it is a new topic, how much it has to do with immunity, especially for young children and infants. I don't know exactly what the cause of the increase of food allergies could be. But I know that there is a correlation between breastfeeding and food allergy onset in children and infants. So I'm not sure if breastfeeding rates have gone down as years have gone forward and formulas have been created, and that's kind of another one of those convenience items. Or in the case that a mother isn't able to breastfeed, maybe that has an impact on the onset of allergies and the increase in them that we see. But that again does relate to immunity. That breastfeeding relates to immunity. So it kind of ties all back around to that point that Heather was making.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. Can we become unallergic to things by taking small doses, for example, by peanuts, taking small doses of peanuts?
So going back to what I was just speaking about with infants and infant feeding and breastfeeding, I remember there was a time, one of my first jobs when I finished my degrees was working at the Women, Infants, and Children clinic. So I was working with a lot of infants, and this was around the time when new research was coming out saying, do I introduce peanut butter to my children, my infant, in fact, at a very young age in hopes to prevent a peanut allergy later on. So I'm not really sure if how that kind of like played out. If we do need to start doing that in our practice, I'm curious to see what you both think about that. I know that when I was there is definitely a choking concern with peanut butter in infants and children. So, but then all this new research came out to introduce that conservatively. So I'm not really sure. I haven't dealt with those infants or children in my own practice in a long time. I would say that's probably the last time I was with that population. So I'm curious to hear what you both think.
Well, I've only had one patient who had a child who trialed a peanut, like it was microdosing. She was working with doctors in California, and it was number one, I think, very exciting, but really, really scary. I mean, really scary to introduce that to a child. And you know, the child at the time, I believe, was around 8 years old, and I just remember the intense psychological component to that, to, you know, having her try these micro doses and knowing that she could very easily, you know, have an anaphylactic reaction. And that's really my only experience with that. So I know that it happens. I know that there are programs available for it, but I don't have much firsthand experience with that, I'm sorry to say.
I would caution about early introduction of pretty much anything. And I think we should still go with, you know, I was a WIC person too, way back in the day, long before I went to medical school or was in nutrition, as I am now. And it was not all the rage in New Mexico, where I lived at the time, to breastfeed. In fact, it was more popular, especially in the community that was of lower income. It was almost thought of as prestigious to feed a synthetic milk or some form of semi-synthetic non-human milk to your baby, which can be a setup for some significant allergens later. And so breastfeeding, to the extent possible, is certainly the preferred way to go. I mean, there are small caveats, and maybe in some areas big caveats, that certain things can be passed through the mother's milk that are already endangering the mother. And so under certain infectious conditions, that may be a problem. But that, what you said, Alyssa, about granting the immune system to those children, that breastfeeding is really critically important, as is even a vaginal delivery for that matter. You know, we have many, many more C-sections now, which is also a contributing factor potentially, because one of the things that establishes our ecosystem from the get-go is that mouthful of, you know, other mucosa, you know, that is alive with organisms. So one of the modern day things that is being done for those women who know they're going into a C-section and don't want to deprive their child of that is they create a swab of the mother's own bodily fluid and then put that in a saline solution so that they can swab the face and the mouth of the child when they arrive, just as though they were passing through the vaginal canal. So that can be a step in the right direction for those kiddos. As far as introducing, I think that you know, I've heard that it's certainly possible, as Sarah witnessed, for somebody to reintroduce something that was offensive previously. But I think that has to be very, very closely monitored by somebody that's been doing that for some time. There are other ways in which the kind of the blueprint of something is introduced and the actual substance is not. So there are different techniques, like one out there that's gotten some, especially footage in the autism community, where you see a lot of sensitivities and reactions to food. And if you look at oh goodness, it's a large scale questionnaire from parents who have tried all kinds of interventions on their children for autism. The things that rank the highest in terms of their objective or their observations is food changes. So eliminating dairy, even above dairy is chocolate, eliminating chocolate. So certain things that cause severe, significant reactions in their children that are food related, or that the only way that they've seen as much benefit is maybe with an anti-seizure medication in terms of turning the seizures around. But other than that, any other medications you look at maybe had helped one, didn't help the other, made the other worse. And then where you see a huge, significant difference, like 30 people benefited when only one got worse, is something like removing chocolate or something like that. So introducing foods, back to that point, if you're going to introduce foods to a child, it should be slow and let their digestive system develop as you do. It doesn't mean you necessarily hold off on peanuts till they're 12. There is a natural time when you might introduce something with peanut in it, or something with egg in it, or something like that. But if you look at something that's a bigger offender like gluten, the earlier you introduce gluten, they've already shown connections between things like schizophrenia and diabetes and other conditions and it doesn't, to run out and blame yourself, parents, if you have schizophrenia in the family for introducing gluten early, but that does contribute significantly to your body burden by having something that is so difficult to digest, those huge proteins that haven't been broken down for you. And as I mentioned before, our cultures who made cultures in the past, one of those cultures that was popular in a preservation way and also to create leavening is sourdough in bread. And so that's the kind of thing that if sourdough is aged long enough and appropriately, it can actually break down the gluten for you, and then the digestion becomes easier. So I think don't be hard on the systems of our children. Treat them gently. There is a difference. It's not just a small adult, and things do develop slowly. So anything that we do that compromise or that challenges their immune system as an infant or as a small child can set it off beyond what we anticipate it should. So go slowly. Yes, introduce them at a given point if you want to. Be careful with your peanuts because, I don't know, you dietitian and nutritionist, you probably know this as well, that, for instance, I sometimes avoid peanuts with my sensitive children and say that's one of the things I might avoid altogether while they're trying to recover from whatever suffering they have, because they tend to be moldy and they tend to disguise the mold. So they are a legume. They're really not a nut. So they're a wet nut, a wet legume that can become moldy, and you don't discern that as much. So sometimes the reaction can be not so much to the legume, but to the mold incurred on that particular legume. And so I tend to go for some other kind of nuts, which are actual nuts, if you're trying to do some kind of nut thing.
Okay. At this point, I want to remind the audience to go ahead and submit your questions in Facebook or YouTube, and we will get to them. The next question, we're going to follow up with the children aspect of this. Is there any difference in the rate of food allergies between children breastfed versus formula?
Absolutely.
Alyssa?
Go ahead, Heather. I think we've kind of hit there. How the breastfeeding and how the vaginal delivery contributes to immunity, and that alone can help determine whether the child will have a food allergy later on in life. So absolutely.
Yeah. The breast milk is like blood with all the nutrients in it and the different immune cells, the natural immune cells from the mother. So that's already like the best makeup it can be.
Okay. What changes in the body during adult onset of an allergy, and what is the difference between that and a child's body?
I would say that the mechanism is largely the same, wouldn't you, Heather? I mean, I think the mechanisms are largely the same. If it's an allergy, I mean, again, how many assaults can a body take? And there's that tipping point with a body burden where, you get to that point and it's one thing too many, and the actual allergy develops. If it's a food sensitivity or an intolerance, I think you're looking at the same thing. But that would be my take on it.
And as the child gets into eating regular foods, if those foods, like maybe the tomato and apple Margaret was talking about, has a chemical pesticide on it, some of those are notoriously offensive to our microbiome. And so an example of that is that there are chemicals that disrupt, and some of you might know this, what's called the shikimate pathway, which is in is a biochemical pathway that our bacteria uses to produce a certain substance, and that certain substance are the substances translated into our neurotransmitters. So the things that make us mentally okay, that are either they're produced not so much by our tissue, but they're produced by the organisms that live in us. And so certain organisms that are certain chemicals that are put heavily on crops today have those chemicals in them that disrupt that pathway. So our worker bees, our ecosystem is full of our own worker bees that are producing product or producing chemicals. And the chemicals are what we actually have our mental state from, our serotonin, which is our feel-good hormone, and our GABA, our calming hormones. So those are produced by our ecosystem. And if we lack that ecosystem, or their chemical pathways are disrupted, they're disrupting them in the plant to kill the organisms, but they're also disrupting them in us, and they're our organisms. So those organisms that are our worker bees, just like they are for the soil and other things for the plant, those being disrupted disrupt us and create an immune response. So if you are a small child that hasn't been exposed as much to those things, you might still have that building capacity. But if you're exposed at an early time, or let's say you grew up on a farm and you did fine, maybe the farm then started using agricultural pesticides and things got worse or went downhill from there. So it's really about the body burden. I think we started there, right? And that is how many things are contending with the resources you have in your body, and how many resources do you have? So one, is there a shortage of the resources you need, including your microbiome? And is there a propensity to be exposed to things that are synthetic or a substitute or are not the real thing, or challenge or competitively inhibit, as we call it, where they take the place of something that should be in your body? So children versus adults, it's really exposure and vulnerability, and it could be generational or it could be in a lifetime. Interesting.
Okay, Sarah, would you like to talk about the document that you have that we will make available on our website?
Oh, sure. So what I did is I just put together a really quick reference sheet. It essentially just goes through and explains the differences between food allergies and food sensitivities. I listed out what kind of tests are available so that you don't need to have written those things down. Briefly explained what antibodies are involved in food allergies and food sensitivities. I've listed out what type of practitioners can help you to get through these things. If you suspect that you have a food allergy or food sensitivity, the kind of practitioner that you can contact. And then also I added a list of helpful resources for deeper support. So these are things that I routinely share with my practice. There are links to Dr. Heather in there. There's a great link to Alyssa. There's a link to be able to reach me. And also I know that Rosemarie is going to be talking in a minute, so I link to that bill as well. So you'll find all of that information present in this document. And I just hope that it would be able to help people, connect. And I don't know about you, but if I'm listening to a conversation, I may not be taking notes. So no worries, it's all captured here for the most part. I think I captured it in advance of what we talked about, but hopefully it'll be helpful.
Okay, that sounds incredibly useful. And for everybody listening in, that document will be available on our website starting tomorrow, sciencecafenh.org. And you probably saw it scroll by as Sarah was talking. So that's the document we're talking about. Next question. Are there any of the home tests that you see online to test for intolerances, ones that you would recommend?
I guess I can start with this one. This is
Sure.
something that I like to be really careful with when you're looking online for things like this. And I'll give an example of me being at Plymouth State University. I had a student who came and she brought me this food sensitivity test results, and was saying, I'm having a hard time eating in the dining hall. It said my food sensitivity test says I can't eat this, I can't eat this, I can't eat this, I can't eat this. So I recommend being very careful with the things that you choose to use to help you determine those things, because another part of nutrition and dietetics that I'm very passionate about is eating disorders. And I would hate to see decisions on diet and nutrition be based on things that aren't necessarily evidence-based. So in the case of this student bringing in a food sensitivity test from somewhere online and then kind of building her diet around that, essentially based on eliminating things, that's something I really like to be careful with, because in an effort to eliminate all of these things, it was evident she was having a hard time building a balanced meal in the cafeteria because she was so consumed by what not to eat, all based on some information that she wasn't really sure, and I wasn't really confident in that was true. So I'm not sure if you both have any other recommendations for food sensitivity testing. I know from my experience and my education in the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is where we're registered through as dietitians, there isn't anything that's given us cold hard evidence that this is there is a good way to determine a food sensitivity, like an approved testing method, I would say. I think they state that the research right now on those things is limited, and I'm not sure if you both know more about that in your practice.
Well, the reason I hesitate to say do something online, I think that some of those groups that do have pretty good tests that can give you a starting point, sometimes you're just not sure, you can't, or maybe you don't have someone to guide you, or don't want to take the time to do a full elimination diet, which we didn't get into terribly deeply tonight, but where you're really removing the things that are offensive and slowly getting them back and getting some help. I hesitate to say do something online or free, out there, because unless it comes with a very strong support system that guides you through the results, it may not be what it looks like. So for instance, the young girl that Alyssa saw that came with a whole list of things, if I were to see a whole list of things with somebody that all look like they're offensive, I would say that person, everything looks like the enemy. And so it's probably an intestinal integrity issue that needs to be addressed, not just eliminate all those things and life will get better. And it could, as she said, lead someone to just becoming more and more nervous or paranoid about what they do put in their mouth, and can lead to eating disorders or add to the eating disorder. But some people's eating disorders do come out of sensitivities that they're just so offended by everything they don't know where to turn. And so sometimes those tests, and that's why it's good to go to a practitioner that's a holistic, functional, integrative type, nutritionist, chiropractor, medical doctor, naturopath, because they have vetted some of those tests and they're not all alike. So if someone says, well, don't do an immunoglobulin test, well, there are different immunoglobulin tests, and some look at a whole array of things. Some look at it on a microchip that looks at all the aspects of gluten, like for instance, that you can break it down into different components, and it looks at, one protein component, another protein. So some get extremely sophisticated in pinpointing what it is that you're offended by. Others look at a combination of things, like they might look at an antibody, but they also look at one of those complements, which is that innate response. It's just a chemical-like reaction that happens and it's elevated during the time that you're exposed to that particular food. So I think it's more helpful in the context of a guided practitioner who's looking at that food sensitivity result in the context of other options and in the context of who you are, and then interpreting not just straightforward as, the green light, the red light, the gold light for what you can and can't have. There's usually a lot more subtleties built in, and some of that just comes with practice and experimenting with the different tests and deciding which one of those might be most beneficial. So you can spend a lot of money getting a test that may not be that beneficial. So I would at least try to get the counsel of a practitioner that's well-versed in the various tests to give you some advice.
I agree 100%. In my experience, I do have people who do ask about home testing. I know that there are a couple of companies that are pretty popular right now, but I also don't recommend it. I mean, I feel as though, for me at least, a good elimination diet, or at least taking out, a few of the major offenders, is usually a really effective way to figure out, food sensitivities and intolerances at least. Certainly with food allergies, like I said, it can be a little bit easier to figure those out because the response is so much bigger usually. But in any case, in that document that'll be linked out for everyone tomorrow, there is a list of some really common ones, or ones that are more likely used in practice. I know that the MRT is a big one around right now. And there's also information there on IgG testing and traditional IgE testing, which would be like the skin prick testing and serum blood testing. So there's info on that in that document as well.
Great, thank you. So I always feel compelled to say, that's one of my favorite questions because it comes from my favorite listener. That was from my daughter and her husband in the San Francisco area. And yes, I'm wearing my Father's Day gift. So thank you. Now we're going to bring in Rosemarie, who is a representative for Merrimack, New Hampshire in the New Hampshire State Legislature, to talk about some things that are going on there with respect to our topic tonight. So Rosemarie.
Thank you very much, Rick. A couple of years ago, I was approached by a constituent whose niece had died. She was a student at UNH. She had frequented this restaurant often with her friends, and she always opted for the spring roll because she knew that wasn't going to trigger a reaction from her peanut allergy. Unfortunately, the restaurant, unbeknownst to her, had changed their recipe and put in a peanut paste, and she had an anaphylactic reaction and later died. So when I was asked by my constituent to bring some sort of legislative remedy to this, I did my own research just to make sure I wasn't going to try and create a solution for a problem that wasn't there. And it was very compelling to see some of the information that I discovered. 32 million people in the US have a food allergy. That's 1 in 13 adults. And 6 million children have a food allergy. That's also 1 in 13 children. It costs the country $24.8 billion a year to address food allergies and the health costs that result from them. And 30% of all cases of food allergies do result in an anaphylactic reaction. And tragically, 150 to 200 of those result in death. So clearly, this is an issue where it's appropriate for the government to come in and do something. There are 6 states currently that have food allergy regulations: Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Virginia. The bill that I drafted, which is HB 1102, which was amended to be named Rachel's Law after Rachel Hunger, the UNH student. What it does is it extends the food allergy requirements in the state of New Hampshire to include 15 towns and cities that are exempt from that food code. Beginning in January 1st of 2021, all restaurants in New Hampshire that are regulated by the Department of Health and Human Services has to have at least one person working during the open hours of the restaurant who has been trained in food allergy awareness and other food safety topics. My bill would extend that requirement to all restaurants, those that license and inspect their own restaurants on their own. The common training is called Serve Safe. It's a very credible, credentialed organization that does this type of training. My bill would also require all restaurants to have on their menus or menu boards a notice that states that patrons have to notify their server of a food allergy. And combining that notice and the training in the restaurant will develop a communication so that it will enable people to identify any opportunities where there might be a risk of a food allergy. For example, some restaurants may thicken a sauce with wheat flour, but if they know someone has a gluten allergy, they can substitute cornstarch or potato starch. So having the kitchen being aware of what's going on in the dining room is going to be really important to prevent food allergy reactions. There's two other bills that, unfortunately, my bill, Rachel's Law, it passed very, very overwhelmingly in the House, but in the Senate, when it was up for a vote, that's when COVID restrictions had shut down the legislative calendar. So it wasn't able to go through the legislative process for this term. But I will be reintroducing that in September, along with two other bills that I'm sponsoring that will require schools and childcare centers to have a food safety, food allergy awareness plan in place for children who suffer from food allergies, so that there is a very descriptive and prescriptive procedure for being able to ensure that those children are safe while they're in school and while they're in their childcare centers. So very exciting. I'm glad that I've been able to work cooperatively with the New Hampshire Restaurant and Lodging Association to make sure that we had a bill that met the needs of not just people suffering from food allergies, but also the restaurants who will take some responsibility in that. And also working with the Department of Health and Human Services to make sure that all of this is workable and that it's a bill that will result in some positive outcomes and security for people who suffer from food allergies, that they can dine safely in New Hampshire.
Great, Rosemarie. Thank you for that. We'll try and follow that and see how you're doing. I want to thank the entire panel. You were great. The time flew by for me. It was a lot of fun. It was very educational. I just want to thank you for your time and your experience. It was a wonderful show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Now we
All right.
pass it
Well,
along
thanks
to
for
Scott.
watching. Thanks for listening. If you missed any of it, you can see it again or show it to your friends. It's on the Science Cafe New Hampshire YouTube channel or our Facebook Live channel. And you can also see some back virtual Science Cafes. And in fact, some of the Science Cafes that we filmed back when we were still outdoors. You can keep up with us by signing up for our newsletter at our website, sciencecafenh.org. And there's also a little spot there to donate money to us if you are so inclined, because after all, these beverages aren't free. Thanks.